Ricky Cox in Indian Valley, and I've got two of my brothers with me today. On your left there's Gerald, and then my oldest brother here's Lynwood. And we do some things together, but this is a job that requires people to be together, so I had to get some help, and that's one of the reasons people quit using saws like this, and we'll talk about some others at some point. But one of them is you got to have some help. It's a dangerous thing, as you can see, and as you will see if you watch that part of the video. But it's much more dangerous if you don't have some people to help, so you're not having to reach across the saw. So the first thing I wanted to do, I was about to finish sharpening the saw, and I thought it might be easier to look at it before we put it on the mandrel of the saw. So I'm touching up the points here. And one of the reasons, another reason that people quit fooling with these things is, as opposed to a chainsaw, which has got about 3 feet of chain. This thing it's 30 inches in diameter, so it's got like, I guess it's 90 inches around or something like that. So they take a long time to file. And I'm just finishing up putting the points on it, and I wanted to see if, I don't know if you can zoom in here on this tooth right here, Hari, but can you zoom in enough to see that there's a flat point on the end of it? You see that little flat point? Okay, that flat point is made by, before you sharpen the saw, you put it on the mandrel and you turn it by hand, and then you touch it with a file or something that's abrasive so that it makes all the teeth the same length. And if there's a little run out in the thing, that doesn't, it's not always the same. In other words, when you put it back on, it may not be, the points may not be perfectly even, but you start with that. So when you file it, one of the things you want to do is file it until that flat part is gone and bring it out to a point, and that point's what does the cutting. And I've almost finished, so I'm just going to hit it a couple more strokes with this file, and you probably can see again with your camera that this face has been filed. And then I'm going to file the back of it until it brings it out to a tapered point. The more taper you put on it, the sharper it'll be and the faster it'll cut. But the faster it will blunt, because if you make it thin and tapered, then obviously it's going to wear away sooner. So there's a happy medium in there somewhere, but I haven't done this enough to really know. And if there's someone viewing this who knows more about it, I'd be happy to hear from them. But we're just going to try to file this one down till that point is gone, till that flat's gone, and bring it out to a point. And then I think one more here would be good enough that we can saw some. So maybe we'll talk at some point about the fact that you have to put set in the teeth. You have to do a process called gumming them. I guess if these are the teeth and this is the gum. And some people, it's also called a gullet, this space right here. And that's for sawdust to collect in there. And it's also so that you don't have to file so much each time. So you cut this little gullet in there periodically, not every time you sharpen it. But there's a lot to that process, and there's some pretty good videos on YouTube about that if you're interested in that. But I'm just going to hit it a couple of licks with this file and see if I can get that flat off and bring that right out to a point, and it should be pretty sharp then. And that flat is just about gone now. Just a little bit of it left. And that's got a point on it now. And then the rest of them are pretty good. So we'll put this thing on, and we'll crank it up and saw some. Now, I don't know if you want to get this part or not. It'll take just a couple of minutes. Get the filings off of it. All right, thank you. And the interesting thing about this thing is all the old mechanics always are watching out for left-handed threads. You get fooled with, like lug nuts on a car. If you ever see one with left-hand threads, it'll fool you because you're not used to them. This is left-handed threads, meaning it turns to the left to tighten it. And the reason they do that is so that if the saw slips any at all, it's turning this way. It's turning in this direction. It's turning clockwise, like so. So if you get it stuck in a piece of wood or something and it starts to slip, the mandrel's going to keep turning this way, and that's going to tighten the nut on it. So if you have a saw on the other end of the mandrel, then it will be a right-handed thread. But that's I'm sure there's been people that spent a lot of time trying to get that nut loose and turning it the wrong way the whole time. So
it's kind of a self-tightening nut, because if it's the opposite from what it should be, it'll actually get loose during your saw process.
Yeah, and the wheels, I'm going to jack this up and tighten that, put that wheel back on. The wheels on this side of this cart are the same way. And a wagon, you know, that you pull with the horses is that way too. They have a nut, and the nut on this side turns, to put it on, it turns to the left. So you can't interchange the two nuts. This one turns to the left. So as this wheel turns, it would tighten that nut. So if you forget to tighten it or something, it would never get loose and run off while you was going down the road. So that's not the right wrench, but that'll work for us. So
One is in that back.
nah, this one looks better. That one, it doesn't have to be tied anyway. We're not going anywhere. But there it is. All right. Now we should be able to crank it up and do something. The engine is 1919 Sears, sold by Sears. And like many things sold by Sears, they didn't make it. I don't know if Sears made anything except catalogs, but they sold a lot of stuff. And they marketed this engine under the name Economy, and because of course people looked to Sears for things that were not expensive but also good quality. It was made by Hercules Engine Company in Evansville, Indiana. So a saw outfit like this is actually kind of rare in Floyd County. There were quite a few of these engines, but most people bought them just this engine by itself, maybe on a cart, and they would use it to run a saw like this freestanding. And we'll look at some of those later, or maybe to hook to one of those mills like we saw in the other video, or to pump water, or to run a small piece of farm equipment like an ensilage cutter or something like that. So outfits like this are more common in the Midwest and places where people had more money, I guess, than they do now. So we'll see if we can get this thing to crank up, and we'll saw some wood. Yeah, let's get that out. Turn it on. What do you think? Good?
A little bit more. That ought to be good.
I think it'll sit there, but you can throw a shock under it if you want to. Well, we mentioned that this engine was made in 1919 and sold by Sears. It was made by the Hercules Company. You can find the virtually identical engines that are painted green that have the Hercules label on them. It's sort of like Buicks and Oldsmobiles and Pontiac. This would be the Chevrolet of the Hercules line, and the Hercules was a little nicer and a little better. They'd be Buicks or Pontiacs or something like that. A couple things about this engine are not authentic and should be pointed out. The ignition system for it, originally this thing had a magneto, which uses magnets, and you rotate, I guess, a wire, an armature or something in a magnetic field, and it generates a spark. And those things failed pretty quickly, and they were sort of beyond the mechanical knowledge of most farmers. And they would replace them with often a coil from a T model, which has points built into it, and you just open and close the current flowing through that thing, and then the points generate the spark to start the thing. This one has a more modern thing that we don't need to go into, but the ignition system has been modernized a little bit. And this axle here certainly didn't come with it. I think that came out from a little camper trailer or something, and a friend of mine gave it to me, and we just had it mounted on there, and you can jack it up, take these wheels off, put modern car wheels on there, use that tongue in the front and pull it down the highway. Originally it had a wooden, it had a tongue made out of wood, and with a cross piece here that bolted to this front axle. And this one, when I got it, didn't have a seat, but I've seen photographs where they actually had a seat mounted right here, and then you hook a couple of horses to it and pull it where you were going to with it. It's a gasoline engine. Some of them ran off kerosene because kerosene was cheaper, and they're always about saving a dollar, a nickel. And it's cooled by water. Sometimes people have seen it and they see steam coming out and they think it's a steam engine, which is a reasonable assumption, I guess. But the steam is being generated by cooling, and the water isn't captured. There's no radiator. It's cooled by evaporation. It's called evaporative cooling. So you have to keep an eye on the water and add some to it. You can see I've got some on my fingers there. And if you fill this hopper up, you can go about all day without having to add water to it. You have to oil it pretty often. You have to oil the valves before you start. You've got to oil here. This oils the cylinder. You got grease cups for the crank shaft, grease cup here for the cam gears, and a lot of little maintenance to it. A lot of these things were destroyed for practical purposes simply by people failing to remember when they got finished at night to open this valve and let the water drain out of it. Because since the water evaporates, you wouldn't put any antifreeze in it, and you've got to drain that out. If you get a few leaves, pine needles or something in there, they sink to the bottom of that thing and stop up these plugs, these drains. You leave the drains open. You leave it sitting out for a few weeks. It gets stopped up. It rains and fills it up. And so many of these you see have cracks where they've been welded up simply because water was left in them and they were frozen and busted. You think of anything else you ought to say about it?
Other than that, before microwaves, you could heat your dinner in that thing, boil your egg or put a can of Vienna sausage down in that water, and it'd be hot when you get ready to eat.
That's true. That's true. And that raises another point about having some help with you. These things don't start very well when they're cold. In fact, in the winter, I usually get some warm water and pour in it and warm it up a little bit. They run, the hotter they get up to a point, the better they run. And the more help you have, the harder you can run it. So the other video talks about it's a hit and miss engine. It doesn't hit every time. And I think I tried to explain it in that video, and I don't know if I did a very good job, but people can look at that and pay attention to that. Or I haven't seen that explained very well online, but you can call me and I'll talk to you about it. But if you have 3 men with this thing and a good supply of wood, you can make a hit about every time, and you'll see what that means. If you listen when we run it, you'll hear that it misses once in a while. And it's not missing. It says hit and miss engine. That's not really accurate. It's not missing. It's just not firing. And that's one reason it's economical. When it gets up to the I can't think of the word.
It has a compression stroke.
Yeah, it gets up to the governed speed. It will. Well, here I am explaining it anyway. But this rod right here opens the exhaust valve, and I'm going to hold the intake valve open, and you can see this rod comes around, and it's going to push that exhaust valve open. And if it's going fast enough, this little latch drops in, and it catches that, and it holds the exhaust valve. It's pushed in, that bottom valve is exhaust, that's held open. So if I turn the crankshaft and the flywheels now, it freewheels, there's no compression. And because there's no compression, it doesn't make any power, but it also doesn't pull in any fuel. There's no vacuum to pull in the intake. So it's not using any gasoline. So that's one of the reasons it's economical. So we're going to try to make it hit every time. And the goal to make it run its best is make that water boil, get it up to boiling temperature, and then you can, in addition to your Vienna sausage, you can boil that egg, and then you could take a shave at the end of the day with the hot water, I guess. So I guess that's enough to say about it. These engines are pretty common. You can go to shows, and if I had to do over, I'd probably just go to shows and not ever buy one and fool with it. But I've had a lot of fun with it. So we're ready to crank it up. And this uses a regular modern auto battery now to provide the spark, or to provide the voltage for the spark. And a modern coil out of a pre-electronic ignition car. That's from something out of the 60s probably. See some spark on there, so we know we got some current. We open this little needle valve. Doesn't have a true carburetor. It's called a mixer because it mixes fuel, but it doesn't have a carburetor in it.
It's hard to move this
no
truck.
needle, no jet. So we're gonna see if it starts, and we're counting on it starting. And then it's going to get kind of loud, and we'll see what happens here. So I'm going to give it a few turns. I'm going to shut the choke on it. I've got the fuel on. I'm going to open the intake valve and crank it over past the compression, and then I'm going to put my thumb on the choke. Well, I guess I can do it by hand. And it should. You hear that? That's an intake valve opening, and it's sucking fuel in. So I'm just go ahead and give it a spin and see what happens. There she goes. Turn the oil on for the cylinder. If you want to, you can either feed it or throw it on the truck, whatever you want to do. I'll give you some.
You gonna put that on it?
You want?
Yeah. You're not gonna put that on it,
Yeah, no more will do. I'll just let him throw them on, and I'll feed it to you.
Grab a hold of it.
I'm gonna speed the engine up a little bit. Choke now, get a little more power. about 4 of them pieces of oak.
Yeah.
Right there. That's the press pulley. It's pressing down on the belt. And you put that near the small pulley because as you can see, the larger diameter it has more surface touching the belt, gripping that belt. But this one has much less surface, so if either one of them slips when that engine hits and you got the saw on, that's the one that's going to slip. So you put that down here to maximize contact of the belt with this pulley. And it also facilitates taking the belt off because if you have it tight enough not to slip, without a press pulley you can't get it on and off without it moving. So the engine's running right now about as well as they ever run. It's hit 3 times and then it's not missing, it's just not hitting because it's not taking any fuel. So they are remarkably efficient for something that's primitive in terms of the head and so on fuel, and that's what people like. But it does make it kind of jerky, and it's also cheaper because it doesn't have a big carburetor or it doesn't. Ready to shut it off there? Okay. I'm going to turn the fuel off. Turn this in and that shuts off the fuel. The needle valve in there. And now when this opens, it's sucking, kind of drawing more fuel, but the valve's so close that it can't get fuel, so it just stars. It's being, you can choke an engine to shut off the air to give it more gas, but then you starve the whole thing to shut it off. So I guess it's sort of, what's the anthropomorphism or something there. And then we'll unhook the battery, and there we are. So we've
Unbuckle the seat belt and you're ready to go.
yeah, so how long did that take us?
I don't know.
Well, this is not like one of those air fryer commercials where you put it in right, and in 2 minutes they show what you cooked. That truck was not already loaded or half loaded when we started. It had a little bit on it.
It had maybe a wheelbarrow load.
But it didn't take long to load it, so it's really not that hard of work. Obviously, the guy on this side has to do more work than anybody else. But
yeah. And if you have the last 2 pieces we saw there were square. That was some old. How old is that stuff? 20 years?
40 probably. It's real seasoned old wood.
The center piece.
It's hard, yeah.
Of oak. So we wanted to saw that to show that it will saw that. But if you had a trailer load of that stuff, and a guy here could easily reach it and slip it across, and the man over here, and maybe a 4th person to pack it into something, and we've done that. That's about the only time this thing really. I mean, it's not gonna. It was replaced by a chainsaw for obvious reasons, but one is that you can operate a chainsaw and do very well by yourself, and you've got, if you're going to saw big stuff or long stuff, you got to have somebody out here to help you, and you got to have someone to get it out of your way, because I've tried that a few times to saw it and let it drop right there.
That's dangerous.
Yes, it gets
real
under your
dangerous.
feet. So if anybody who views this has got one of these, I don't know if anybody still got one in Floyd County or not, but you got to keep things clear under your feet. You don't want to be tripping and stumbling with these things.
You don't have like modern machinery, you don't have a blade guard. And when you're receiving the wood, you got to make sure you got to hold it loosely, because if you grab too tight, it puts side tension and it puts the blade in a bind.
Yeah.
You have to pay attention
Might
to
grab
that.
the wood and throw it, There's a lot of ways to get hurt with it, and one important thing.
We're not going to demonstrate them.
Yeah, we're not going to do that. But you want to stay out so you're not in direct line with the saw, so that if you did fall forward, you're not going to. And
Right.
many of them, even in this era, this is from the teens, the cart, I think. Even then, some of them had a minimal guard of some kind, just a hoop of metal that would sort of catch you if you fell toward it. But most people who had harm with them, they lost fingers and things like that. And we had an uncle that one of our favorite, my favorite uncle, I'm sure there's too, Uncle Monroe was a real old timer. He knew about all this stuff. And when we were kids, I was fascinated by the fact that when he wore a pair of gloves, I think it was that one right there, that left little finger, that finger flopped around because his finger was gone. And that was, to a kid, that's kind of mysterious. So after I was grown, I asked him about that. And he said he was working at a sawmill.
He was in a hurry.
Yeah.
Man in a hurry.
If they must have never been up there, they'd know there's nothing up there that's that
Urgent.
urgent, that you need to see
Just
that.
potholes in the road.
Yeah, but anyway, he was working at a sawmill, and as I mentioned to you in the email, these things were really well suited to sawing up a slab pile. And as I mentioned, Gerald here, he's familiar.
40 years ago or 50 years ago, it was real common for sawmills to operate out in the woods, portable mills, and they would generate big slab piles because they didn't have a lot of use for the slab wood, and it was waste.
And they didn't have a way to stretch it, grind it, or make compost, or what do they call it, mulch.
So they just left it in the woods, and then farmers, or the landowners or whoever would go in and cut it up. And this thing really worked good, cutting up slab wood, because
it's already piled up. It's got a flat side.
And that's another reason for not having a guard that really permanent on here, because it would be all different dimensions. The slabs might be this wide, or thin or thick or whatever, so it's pretty hard to keep a guard that wouldn't be having to be readjusted all the time. Slab wood is when you take a log, for instance. When you got certainly bigger than this, but a log, when they take it start it through the sawmill, they have to clean up the edges first. So they'll saw through on this side, and this waste is the waste wood. That would be called a slab. And they'll take one slab and maybe one board, and then they'll flip it over, and they'll go over here and do the other side, slab wood, and then they may saw to get it squared up, and then of course when you turn it the other way, you got another one. So you're going to have 4 slabs off of every log. No matter how big or how little that log is, there's going to be 4 slabs off of it. So that was waste at one time. Now that wood is ground up and used for, mulch, for landscaping, or even for fuel for biomass burners and that kind of thing. So there's not any of it available anymore as far as slab goes. So that kind of took away some of the use for this thing. But back when I was 30 years old or whatever, and Ricky and our dad, we went around several different places and sawed up old slabs. And we got into some hickory up near the Buffalo, and it really worked good, because that hickory, when it gets a little seasoned, is pretty hard on a chainsaw. So this thing did a pretty good job on that. You need to do one piece at a time. And I know you probably noticed when he would drop one, I would take something and knock it out of the way, because you don't want to be doing this. And we don't have to try to consider starting what they call a new norm with social distancing with this thing, because everybody needs to have their area and stay in it. He don't need to be coming over here and reaching here, and I don't reach over here. And everybody needs to know what the other one's going to do and what he shouldn't do, because that's the way you get hurt. I mean, you got to have a lot of respect for safety when you're operating something like this, because there's been people lost arms and hands and whatever, with stuff like this, and not always because they were reckless, but a lot of times it was. So
Yeah.
You don't want to get in a hurry.
If folks that are interested in this, if you've got time to get on the internet and you look for buzzwood saw or cordwood saw or cutoff saw or even wood saw, which would be pretty vague, but a buzzwood or cordwood cutoff saw, you can find information about them, and you can still buy outfits that'll fit on the back of the tractor with a 3-point hitch, and they have they have even retractable guards, so that when the saw, when the table moves forward, the guard moves backward with it, and they're much safer, but they're still.
And they were more common to this area. I mean, there's
this
several of those
unusual.
things sitting around, you know. Either they were just on a stand and you run them with the pulley, or some of the more modern ones actually fit on the 3-point hitch of a tractor with the pulley that run off your power takeoff.
You just back up to your wood and set it down and go to work. And I've got, if you have time, I've got a couple sitting around within 1/8 of a mile here that I can show you some examples of other types. And I was going to finish telling about Monroe, our uncle. He told me that story in the context of a $2 bill. He had given me a $2 bill. And he was very generous. He's always giving us something. And he gave me a cement mixer not a long time. And my brother just rebuilt it for me. And anyway, he said that he was playing cards, playing poker at lunch at this sawmill, and he won a $2 bill. And he forgot to tear the corner off of it, because I don't know if you've heard this, but pretty common bit of folklore, superstition, that a $2 bill is unlucky. You ever heard that? You all ever heard that?
I'm getting ready to.
Yeah.
I never have before.
Well, the story on that, there's always an explanation or many explanations for folk beliefs like that. And the $2 bill one this is the story I heard, that most cash registers, the tills in cash registers, did not have a place for $2 bills. And merchants, for that reason, didn't like them, because clerks didn't know what to do with them, and they were easily confused with the $20 bill. So they would do something to deliberately deface them so that the Treasury would recall them, and it would be expensive to have to replace, because you know a bill might stay in circulation for years. But they wanted to circulate out. So supposedly someone started the rumor that a $2 bill is unlucky unless you tear one corner off. In which case, when it gets back to the bank, apparently they'll take it out of circulation. So at any rate, our uncle believed that a $2 bill was unlucky. So he won a $2 bill, whistle blew, or probably was a gas engine, not steam. But anyway, it's time to go back to work, and he just hurriedly got his, put his money away and got his gloves on. He was running the cutoff saw because they were cutting the slabs up as they came off the saw and selling them to somebody. They had enough help to do that. So the first one, he gets that slab on there, and he goes like that and cut that little finger off. And he told me that was because he believed that was because he'd failed to. The only reason he could think of was he had just failed to tear the
Yeah,
corner
he
off
blamed
the
it
$2
on that.
Well, that
He
was the
couldn't
reason.
blame it on the government, so he blamed it on that.
Well, anyway, that made it memorable to me. And all the time. Do y'all remember that? He'd wear them yellow
I just
handy
knew he
andy
had a
gloves.
finger missing.
And that little glove, that little hole, space for that finger, just flopped around. And I thought, now is his finger in there? And then I forget to look, but that finger was missing. And that's how he.
You thought he was drinking tea, didn't you? Holding a teacup.
Yeah. I just don't have any sense of how long. It wasn't more than a half an hour, I don't think.
I think it was a half hour.
About a half
But
an
I did a
hour.
lot of takes, so I couldn't tell by
Yeah.
film. About a half
It was
hour.
probably 11:30 when we started. It's 1 o'clock now. I don't really know, but it's
We didn't get started till like 12 something.
okay.
I set up.
Well, it's if you are set up to do it and got help, you can make a pile of wood.
Yeah.
But the setup time is long, and having help and those things, and the danger of it, and the complication of getting your power and all that. It's become obsolete. But you have to consider any technology. To judge it, you have to consider it against what it replaced, not against what replaced it. And if you were out here like this, you could cut those little things with an axe. A good person who's a good sharp axe, but could cut those little poles. But you got to move them. You got to lay them across something sturdy to cut them. and or you got to lay it up in one of those crossbuck things like the X's, you know, and then you lay it in there and you saw it with a crosscut saw or a little buck saw or something like that. And if those are good and sharp, you can saw, but you're not going to saw up a pile of that. So if you've got neighbors that'll come and help you and you help them and they borrow your saw or exchange work with people. So it's better suited to a more communal, group-oriented neighborhood, or where people swap work with each other. And
Yeah.
we don't have to do that
You have
anymore.
brothers close by.
Yeah, that's right. See, I could call them and
Yeah.
and I might do something for them one day and help them out a little bit.
He helped me with wood.
Yeah. So it's there's technology factors, there's economy factors, and there's also cultural factors that affect, like the corn mill and all those things. So we wouldn't try to make a living at it by any stretch, but it is kind of fun to. I think it's kind of fun to get it out. And like you said, I think you said your grandfather had a gas engine. It
Yeah.
just ran.
Yeah.
So if you can actually make it do something, and it's a lot more interesting to other people, and you feel a little more justified in spending your time and money if you get some product out of it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess I'm gonna go.
Thank you, Woody.
Nice to see you, Art.
Nice to see you.
Take care.
We'll see you later. Well, yeah. All right. I mentioned to Hari in talking about this that some people, this example, I took this thing to Ferrum, to the Folklife Festival for several years, and at one point I mentioned that people would ask if this was a steam engine, and I would explain that it produces steam minimally, but it's not driven by steam. And other people would ask if this is a sawmill. They'd never seen a sawmill, and I would think that was funny, I guess, but surely a lot of people haven't seen a sawmill. But one important difference, aside from the scale of it, you know, this isn't heavy or strong enough to saw actual logs, but the key difference is that with the saw, you put a piece of wood on here in this direction, and it slides this way, and you're cutting it off to whatever length. And to do that, you cut every single fiber that's in this piece of wood. You cut it, but you only cut it once. You cut it, so this, I don't know if you can see, there's a view, you kind of need to see the end of this thing. You can't see that from there, can you?
I can see the points.
Okay.
Get another shot of the end.
All right, yeah, this point, these points alternate. Every other point is, one point's like this, and the next one's like this, and then so on. So when you look down the center of it, it's like a V formed by those points. So when this one hits, it cuts one side of a fiber, and then just a fraction of a second afterward, this one, which the tip is on the other side, alternating tips, it cuts the other side of that fiber. And then that little bit of sawdust, that little short length of fiber, that's the width of the width of that fiber is the width defined by these two successive points. Then that falls to the ground here. It is carried out. So that's a cutoff saw. It's cutting off something across the grain. And if you got an old handsaw that your dad had or something, probably it's I can't think of the word for it now. There's a rip saw, and then there's a, it's escaped me, but that's a word I know, but I can't think of it. But a sawmill, instead of cutting this way, a sawmill cuts this way. So this would be a log, and it's fed into that saw parallel with the side of the saw. So instead of cutting every fiber in here one time, it's cutting the same fibers thousands of times. So if you have something that's a fiber oriented in this direction, and this point of this tooth hits the end of that, it's simply going to try to separate. It's just going to try to split it. It's going to go between those fibers. And the next one, but the fiber's still attached. It can split them. The next one hits, it's going to split it a little, the fraction of an inch to that other side. But those points, instead of cutting the fibers and pulling them out of the wood, they simply spread them apart, and it's in a, you know, it's not going to go very far before it's just going to wedge into the wood. So a saw that's filed with alternating points, it's no good for ripping. So that's why all the old carpenters had to have at least two saws. They had one for cutting across the grain. I guess a crosscut, that's the word I want, crosscut saw. And then they had to have one for ripping. Like if you have a long plank, a crosscut saw is no good. It's just going to start into the end of that, but it can't cut off lengths of that fiber and pull it out. It can just separate it. So if you tried to put a blade like this on a sawmill, it would just jam. Instead, what you have to have on a sawmill is a blade where instead of having a point here and then a point here alternating, you have to have 2 points. And that point, instead of being angled, if you could see these head on, you see that they're like this. There's one like this, then there's one like this, there's one like this, and there's one like this. If you look at the end ways at a sawmill blade, they're flat. They don't have points. They have a point on each corner. They have corners rather than points. So that flat blade, it's like a chisel. It would be like taking a chisel and a hammer and driving the chisel into this and severing those fibers completely, and then severing them again and again and again and again and again, the same set of fibers over and over. So a blade that has alternating points is a crosscut blade. It's for cutting fibers and pulling them out, short sections of all the fibers. And then a rip saw blade has a flat blade, and then it's spread out on both sides. It has to be what they call swayed so it won't hit the sides. So if I put a sawmill blade on here, it wouldn't cut that. It would just jam in it because it can't sever those fibers. And if I put this blade on a sawmill, it wouldn't work either because it would try to split the fibers, but it couldn't cut off. It couldn't cut the ends of them. Skill saw blades you buy today, they are engineered so that they'll do both. They probably don't do either perfectly. A chainsaw blade does both. But if you've ever tried to cut, or a chainsaw chain, if you try to take a log and stand it up like this and try to cut down into the end of it with a chainsaw, it doesn't go very well because it's got to cut the ends of those fibers off. If you have to cut a piece of wood like this with a chainsaw, it's better to knock it over like this and cut it like that so it can pull out long pieces of fiber rather than having to cut them off into tiny little pieces. So does that give you a rough idea about that? So it would not work on a sawmill. And the other thing I wanted to point, or two other things I wanted to say. One was that contemporary with these was a saw called a shingle saw, and it's about the same size. It's got a cast iron frame. It could be powered by that machine, but the difference in a shingle saw and a cut-off wood saw is the same difference between a sawmill and this cut-off saw. A shingle saw cuts in grain, and this is a shingle. It's not sawn. It's been riven. It's been split. When these engines came along, people figured out that they could drive a saw that would make shingles not by splitting them, which is very labor-intensive, and you got to have good straight wood. You can't have any knots or anything. They made up a saw that had a blade like a sawmill on it, and they would saw shingles like this, and in a little taper, in like a little wedge shape. And they were very common around here. I've never seen one at an auction, but this house was built in 1892. It had sawn shingles on it. If we have a minute, we'll walk over to one of those buildings and look. You can see on the outside that building with the corrugated tin roof, metal roof, not tin, it's metal, steel. That has metal on the outside, but inside you can see it still has sawn shingles that were put on there in the 30s. And instead of tearing them off, they just put metal over top of them so we can see what they look. And when you see a shingle, you can tell the difference between riven, because riven, you can see the grain. It's been split with the grain. But a sawn shingle, you'll see circular saw marks because it's been sawed. And a riven shingle is much cheaper. Pardon me, a sawn shingle is much cheaper and faster to make, but doesn't last as long. because when you cut, unless the wood is perfectly straight, so that when you cut, you're cutting with the grain, you're going to be cutting across fibers, and the ends of those exposed ends of those fibers are going to absorb water, and it's going to rot. It's not going to last near as long. So it's like so many things: faster, cheaper, quicker, easier, but maybe not quite as durable. And then one other thing I wanted to show you was about the blades. We showed somewhere in this video there will be a section where you can see the file and the teeth. And this is a blade. I don't know where I got this. You used to see these at auctions all the time. It probably was 30 inches when it started. It's probably like 20, 24 or something like that now. So it's been sharpened a lot of times. It still has the gullets in here. These are correct. The gullets run in a line somewhere like 2/3 from the center to the rim. The back of that gullet runs. And but what's badly wrong with these teeth is the fronts of them. Someone got in a hurry. It takes a long time. They're supposed to be filed so that they are like these, in a line with the center of the saw. The face of that tooth is supposed to be parallel to a line that goes from the tooth through the center of the saw. Because if you take the easy way and say, I don't have enough time to file that whole tooth, and you just file this point, so what happens is eventually you're in a hurry, so you start filing like that, and then like that, and then like that, because that's quick. Instead of filing the whole thing, you wind up with a tooth that looks like this. And even though that point may be sharp, this angle is going to hit your wood before the point of the tooth does. So when you notice when this thing was running, it didn't take much effort to push it into the saw. My brother, he had to push, and he was pulling it back to get it out, and it probably should have a spring on it to pull it back, but it's intended to sort of feed itself into it, because the face of that tooth, correctly formed tooth, sort of pulls the wood into it. But if you get the wrong angle on that tooth, like here, it's going to knock it out. If we sharpened the saw and put it on here and started it up, it would saw, but you'd have to stand back here and force that thing into that saw. So another reason that people quit using them was that if they didn't know a little bit about how to sharpen them, they became just like just using brute force just to beat the wood into. And you know, if you've got enough horsepower, you can do that, but it's a very inelegant and unsatisfying and dangerous way to do something. Any sharp tool is always safer than a dull one, which is sort of counterintuitive, because you have to force. You're not like a blood. I'm sure in your gardening you've pared things and cut things, and if you have to force something, you lose control of the tool. So that's important to know. If anybody was ever fooling with these things, you need to make sure you sharpen your saws correctly, and it takes time and effort, and I don't know if it's worth that. So that's the difference between a sawmill. The gumming is and I think it must. I don't know if that's maybe that's just a colloquial term, but my assumption is that if these are the teeth, then these are the gums. You know, that the teeth come from the gum. So this would be like the gum, although I've only heard the word gumming, meaning to deepen these semicircular, they're called gullets, actually, as opposed to gums, but they have to be deepened for a couple of reasons. One, as you sharpen, because if you keep sharpening that and you get back to here, when you file that off flat, you're going to start cutting into that. And you never want a sharp corner in a piece of steel. If you're making anything out of steel, and I guess wood's the same way, you want to avoid sharp corners because sharp corners are weak, and that's where it's going to crack. If you ever, you've seen people, something's got a crack in it, they drill a hole in it, even a piece of glass or ceramic. If you put a hole in it, that'll stop the crack. So that circular shape prevents cracks, and it also makes a space for sawdust to accumulate till it can get out of the piece of wood. And if you're cutting a small little piece of wood, it's not going to be that much space. That's the case where a sawmill gives you a better example. A sawmill's got to have those gullets, because if you're sawing a log this big, and that tooth, the first tooth, that wedge-shaped flat tooth comes in there and chisels off sawdust, as it's going all the way through that log, it's chiseling off the end of that fiber. By the time it comes out of the bottom of that log, it's accumulated a lot of sawdust, so you got to have a space for that to collect. Cutting little wood like that, it's never going to be an issue. But the main thing, I guess, is in this case, is so that you don't have to file the whole thing, and you're not filing a sharp corner into the inside of it. So you have to keep the gullets cut down. You have to file it, these faces parallel to the center line of the saw. You have to file the back of the tooth to give it a little bit of an angle here, so that the tooth is pointed and not flat. And also you file the back to get rid of that flat place. You just fasten a piece of wood here like this, and you clamp a file to it, and then you push it up there to that thing, and then you turn the saw blade so that it rubs that file. And then that cuts the tips of the tooth down until they're all the same length. And then you file it till that flat comes out of it. And you can see, probably Hari, you can still see right there, there's a flat that I failed to file out of. So that tooth's not doing as much work as the others. And since you got your camera there, can you, if you sight right across the top of it, can you see the V in that?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get.
Yeah, if you get the rim of the saw, you can see that V.
Yeah.
Turn that thing. This is the direction the saw is turning, and you can see, if you see the top, and if the sun is right, you can actually see some of those flats. Like there's a bad one right there. Am I in your viewfinder?
I got you, yep.
There's a little flat right there that I failed to file off, and if I've laid that file down and can't find it, but if I had a file, I mean, this could represent a file. So I want to file the face of this tooth. Let me find that little, where's the one with the flat? Right there. I want to file the face of this tooth in line with the center of the saw, and I also want to file a little angle on it like that. And then I want to file the back of it. I don't want to file the point. I don't want to cheat and file it off to get my point quickly. I've got to file so that I'm not taking anything off except right here on this corner right here. And I would file it back until that flat is gone, leaving just that tiny little point. I got in a hurry, I didn't do the whole thing. And I'm also filing an angle on that thing so that this tooth is, as you see here, not flat. I don't want my tooth to be flat. I want it to have a little angle on it like that. So that in succession, this tooth cuts one end of a piece of wood fiber. This one cuts the other end. That little piece of fiber then is loose. It just needs to be knocked out and carried out, and then it'll drop to the ground as sawdust. And you can actually see flat like this, it would be like a chisel, like taking a chisel. But instead of a chisel, this is just cutting one little groove. The next one cuts another groove, and then the sawdust is free to fall out. And you can see this piece right here, this bigger piece. I would say, I'd guess that's a piece of that pine. The last thing we saw, I picked up an old dead pine limb, very soft. So it took out, that held together. So that's, I don't know, hundreds, I guess, of wood fibers cut on one end, and then the next tooth cuts the other end, and then they get pushed out of that groove, which is called a kerf when you're sawing something. And some of these finer pieces, like this really dark stuff here, that's probably some of that oak that we sawed. You just can't, you just can't saw it as fast. So that's enough to say about that. I guess unless you have a question, or if I could make something a little more clear, or whatever.
I think that was good.
Okay.
And I can see that angle.
Yeah, and
Every one goes a little bit opposite.
yeah, and a handsaw is the same way. They say if you file a cross-cut handsaw properly, you can take a needle and lay it in that groove, and the needle will slide right down that groove if you turn it, and it should shoot perfectly straight right out the end of that thing. And then the final thing, I guess, is you have to have set. I think I mentioned that before. You can see that the ends of these teeth have been bent. They're not like that, they're a little bit like that. And that's what gives you clearance. That makes the cut, the kerf, the fiber that's being removed is actually wider than the thickness of the saw plate. Because if they're the same, unless you hold that thing perfectly straight, it's going to rub the sides of the saw and get hot and jam and so on. So you've got to have a little bit of, you got to have set in that tooth, and that's a tricky thing. Some people just take a little piece of steel, like to function as an anvil, like a heavy hammerhead, and then take another hammer and hit it, and that bends it, but it's just random. And then maybe this tooth is bent more than this tooth, so this tooth never does any work. This one does all the work. It gets dull, and then that one maybe starts